Lesson 16, Senses. 16.1, Sensory Receptors. Sensory receptors are specialized structures that detect a specific stimulus, a specific change either in our environment or that stimulus can arise from inside our body. So this is the basis for the first most general classification of sensory receptors. An exteroceptor detects a change, some stimulus outside the body. An interoceptor detects a stimulus from inside the body. Receptors can also be classified based on the type of stimulus that is detected. For example, a chemoreceptor detects the presence of a specific chemical. We'll see some examples of these. Smell receptors and taste receptors are examples of chemoreceptors, but there are also chemoreceptors other places. For example, in the walls of arteries that detect the concentration of carbon dioxide versus oxygen. This would also be chemoreceptors. A photoreceptor detects specific photons of light. Mechanoreceptors normally detect pressure. Some type of mechanical pressure is applied and that deforms the receptor so it can detect the stimulus. Thermoreceptors detect changes in temperature. There are others called nociceptors, which are pain receptors. Sensation occurs if a stimulus is strong enough to cause threshold depolarization. Recall from the previous lesson, we can have small changes in the voltage, the membrane potential, and not necessarily reach a threshold level where the action potential is initiated. However, if that stimulus is large enough, we do reach threshold depolarization. An action potential can be initiated that's going to move along the sensory neuron into the central nervous system. Sensory receptors can also carry out some integration, so in some cases they can process the stimuli that are occurring. One way that they do this is called summation. So if we have multiple sub-threshold depolarizations, what this means is that individually they are not strong enough to initiate an action potential. However, if a number of these sub-threshold depolarizations occur in very rapid succession or very close to one another, those have an additive effect, and we can reach threshold in this manner. Sensory receptors can also undergo sensory adaptation. What this means that if you stimulate them repeatedly, they will begin to ignore you. They will stop responding to repetitive stimulation. Perfect example of this is you put on cologne early in the morning, and whenever you first put that on, you can smell the cologne. After a few hours, you are no longer aware that that smell is present. And this is because sensory adaptation has taken place in these smell receptors, and they have simply quit responding to that stimuli. Perception of a stimulus occurs in the cerebrum of the central nervous system. Recall those sensory cortexes up in the cerebrum, and so that is where conscious perception takes place. So if we have a threshold level depolarization from a large stimulus, that can initiate the action potential that is sent along the sensory neuron into the central nervous system. But then recall there can also be some processing. All sensory input, with the exception of smell, has to pass through the thalamus. And much of the sensory input is edited and filtered out, and in fact is never sent to those somatosensory cortexes of the cerebrum. And so much of the stimuli we still do not perceive. So for example, as you sit there, are you consciously aware of your clothes touching your body? Probably not. This is an example of a couple of things. We can have sensory adaptation, so the sensory receptors quit responding, but also much of this is simply filtered out in the central nervous system. Some other types of receptors. Proprioceptors are specialized interoceptors, so these are inside the body. They are detecting change inside the body. Specifically, this keeps up with our own body position and posture in three-dimensional space. We find proprioceptors in joints. So again, as you sit there, are you aware of the position of your joints? You don't have to look to know that your arm is bent or your knee is bent because these proprioceptors are constantly sending this information to the central nervous system. There are other proprioceptors in muscles, and they are constantly sending information up to the central nervous system concerning how much tension, how much stress or stretch is on muscles. And so with all of this proprioceptor input, we typically know exactly where we are. We know the position of our body. There are many cutaneous receptors. These are different receptors that are associated with the skin. And so there are a number of these that are illustrated here in this diagram. We have some free nerve endings. These typically detect pain and temperature. There are some others that are up very close to the surface of the skin. Merkel disc, for example, right beneath the epidermis. And these are involved in very fine discriminate touch. There are some others that are down deeper in the dermis. We perceive this as pressure or perhaps vibration rather than the very fine touch.